Maria Santos had dreamed of serving her country since she was 12 years old. Growing up in a small Texas town, she watched her older brother return from deployment with stories that made her eyes shine with determination. Now at 23, she stood proudly in her crisp military uniform at Fort Henderson, one of only 15 women among 300 soldiers on the base. The morning sun cast long shadows across the training grounds as Maria adjusted her equipment belt. Today marked her 6th month at the base, and she had worked twice as hard as anyone else to prove she belonged here. Her drill sergeant had noticed her dedication, recommending her for advanced tactical training that usually took soldiers years to qualify for. Maria's reputation had spread throughout the base. She could outrun most of the men during morning drills. Her marksmanship scores consistently ranked in the top 5, and her strategic thinking during war games impressed even the most seasoned veterans. But with recognition came unwanted attention from those who believed women had no place in combat roles. General Robert Hawkins commanded Fort Henderson with an iron fist. At 55, he was a decorated veteran with 30 years of service, but his old-fashioned views about women in the military were well known among the troops. He believed that mixing genders in combat situations created unnecessary complications and weakened unit cohesion. Maria had heard whispers about his harsh treatment of female soldiers, but she had managed to avoid direct confrontation with him until now. The incident began during what should have been a routine morning inspection. Maria stood at attention with her unit as General Hawkins walked down the line, his cold gray eyes scrutinizing every detail of their appearance. When he stopped in front of her, she could feel the tension radiating from his presence. Her uniform was spotless, her boots polished to mirror shine, and her posture perfect. But General Hawkins found fault where none existed. He claimed her hair was out of regulation, though it was properly secured in a tight bun exactly as required by military standards. Other soldiers in the formation watched nervously as the general's voice rose, his accusations becoming increasingly personal and degrading. Maria maintained her composure, responding respectfully to his criticism while standing perfectly still. What happened next would become the talk of the entire base for weeks to come. Without warning, General Hawkins reached forward and roughly grabbed Maria's hair, yanking it hard enough to pull several strands loose from her carefully arranged bun. The sudden violence of the action shocked everyone present, including the other officers who had never seen their commanding officer cross such a clear line. Maria felt a surge of anger and humiliation as pain shot through her scalp, but years of military training had taught her to control her reactions. She remained at attention even as her hair hung partially loose around her shoulders, her jaw clenched tight to prevent any sound from escaping. The other soldiers in formation looked straight ahead, but she could sense their discomfort and anger on her behalf. General Hawkins seemed to expect her to break down or react emotionally, giving him justification for whatever punishment he had planned. He stood there for several long seconds, waiting for her to give him a reason to escalate the situation further. But Maria had learned early in her military career that the best way to handle bullies was to refuse to give them the satisfaction they craved. The silence stretched on as the entire formation held their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Maria could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears, but she kept her eyes focused straight ahead, refusing to look directly at the general or show any sign of weakness. This was her moment of truth, and how she responded would determine not just her own future, but potentially the future of every woman who would serve under General Hawkins' command. In that moment of crisis, Maria made a decision that would change everything. Instead of cowering or becoming emotional as the general expected, she chose a response that nobody could have predicted. Her next action would not only shock General Hawkins and everyone present, but it would also set in motion a chain of events that would eventually transform the entire culture of Fort Henderson and beyond. Maria took a deep breath and did something that stunned everyone present. She calmly reached up, removed the remaining pins from her hair, and let it fall completely loose around her shoulders. Then, looking directly at General Hawkins for the first time, she spoke in a clear, steady voice that carried across the entire formation. "Sir, with respect, my hair was in complete regulation before you grabbed it. If you believe there is an issue with military standards, I request that you document this incident properly and follow the appropriate Disciplinary procedures outlined in the Uniform Code of Military Justice. The boldness of her response sent shockwaves through the assembled soldiers. No one had ever challenged General Hawkins so directly, especially not a young female soldier. The general's face turned red with rage, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. For a moment it seemed like he might explode with anger. But Maria's calm professionalism had put him in an impossible position. Captain Jennifer Walsh, the base's legal officer, had been watching the entire incident unfold from her position near the administration building. She immediately recognized the legal implications of what had just occurred and quickly began recording everything on her phone. As a military lawyer, she knew that General Hawkins had just committed assault in front of dozens of witnesses, and Maria's measured response had been absolutely perfect from a legal standpoint. The other soldiers in the formation remained frozen, unsure of how to react to this unprecedented situation. Some felt admiration for Maria's courage, while others worried about the potential consequences for everyone involved. They had all heard stories about what happened to soldiers who crossed General Hawkins, and they feared that Maria had just signed her own discharge papers. General Hawkins realized that he had made a serious mistake. His impulse to humiliate Maria had backfired spectacularly, and now he was the one who looked unprofessional and out of control. He tried to regain his authority by dismissing the formation, but the damage was already done. Word of the incident would spread throughout the base before lunchtime, and he knew that his reputation was now in serious jeopardy. Maria quietly pinned her hair back up and fell in with her unit as they were dismissed. She could feel hundreds of eyes on her as she walked back to the barracks, but she kept her head high and her pace steady. Inside, her heart was racing, and she knew that she had just taken an enormous risk that could destroy her military career. But she also knew that she had done the right thing, not just for herself, but for every woman who would serve after her. Back in her quarters, Maria sat on her bunk and finally allowed herself to process what had just happened. Her hands were shaking slightly as she realized the full magnitude of her situation. She had publicly challenged one of the most powerful men on the base, and there was no telling how he might retaliate. But she also felt a sense of pride and relief that she had stood up for herself with dignity and professionalism. Within hours, Captain Walsh appeared at Maria's door with a serious expression on her face. She explained that she had witnessed the entire incident and had already begun documenting everything for a formal complaint. As a legal officer, she had a duty to report instances of misconduct, especially when they involved assault and harassment. She assured Maria that she would have full legal support if she chose to file charges against General Hawkins. The news of Captain Walsh's involvement sent ripples of excitement and anxiety throughout the base. Everyone knew that she was one of the most respected officers on the installation, and her decision to support Maria lent serious credibility to the situation. Some soldiers began quietly coming forward with their own stories of mistreatment by the general, while others worried about the potential chaos that a full investigation might bring. Maria spent the rest of the day fielding visits from fellow soldiers who wanted to express their support. Many of the women on the base told her that they had experienced similar treatment, but had been too afraid to speak up. Several male soldiers also approached her privately, admitting that they had witnessed inappropriate behavior but hadn't known how to address it, without risking their own careers. As evening approached, Maria received word that she was to report to the base commander's office first thing in the morning. She knew that this meeting would likely determine her future in the military, and she spent hours that night preparing for what might be the most important conversation of her life. She reviewed military regulations, practiced her statement, and steeled herself for whatever consequences might come. The next morning, Maria walked across the base toward the command headquarters with her shoulders squared and her uniform immaculate. She had barely slept, but her resolve had only grown stronger overnight. As she passed groups of soldiers, she noticed the conversations that stopped mid-sentence, and the mixture of supportive nods and worried glances that followed her. Colonel Patricia Morrison, the base commander, was a 48-year-old career officer who had worked her way up through the ranks despite facing many of the same challenges that Maria now confronted. She had heard about the incident within hours of its occurrence, and had spent the evening reviewing security footage and interviewing witnesses. What she had discovered troubled her deeply. When Maria entered the colonel's office, she was surprised to find Captain Walsh already present, along with a man in civilian clothes who introduced himself as Agent David Chen. from the Inspector General's office. The formal atmosphere told Maria that this situation had escalated far beyond a simple disciplinary matter, and she felt both nervous and relieved that higher authorities were taking it seriously. Colonel Morrison began by assuring Maria that she was not in trouble and that the meeting was purely for fact-gathering purposes. She explained that several soldiers had come forward with additional complaints about General Hawkins's behavior, and that a formal investigation was being launched. Maria's incident had apparently been the catalyst that finally gave other victims the courage to speak up about their own experiences. Agent Chen took detailed notes as Maria recounted the events of the previous morning, asking specific questions about the general's exact words and actions. He explained that similar complaints had been filed at other bases where General Hawkins had previously served, but that victims had often been too intimidated to follow through with formal charges. Maria's decision to stand her ground had provided investigators with their first solid case. As the interview progressed, Maria learned shocking details about the scope of General Hawkins's misconduct. At least 12 other female soldiers on the base had experienced inappropriate treatment, ranging from verbal harassment to physical intimidation. Several male soldiers had also come forward to report witnessing incidents that made them uncomfortable, but they had been afraid to speak up due to the general's reputation for harsh retaliation. Captain Walsh presented the security footage she had obtained, which clearly showed General Hawkins grabbing Maria's hair without justification. The audio was also clear enough to capture his inappropriate comments and Maria's professional response. Agent Chen explained that this evidence, combined with witness testimonies, would form the foundation of a criminal case against the general. The colonel then shared some surprising news that would change everything for Maria. Due to her exemplary service record and her courageous handling of the situation, she was being recommended for immediate promotion to sergeant and assignment to the base's elite tactical unit. Furthermore, she would be offered the opportunity to attend officer candidate school if she was interested in pursuing a commission. Maria was overwhelmed by this unexpected turn of events. What had started as a humiliating attack on her dignity was now leading to career opportunities that she had never imagined possible, but she also felt the weight of responsibility that came with her new role as an advocate for other soldiers who had faced similar treatment. The meeting concluded with Agent Chen explaining the investigation timeline and what Maria could expect in the coming weeks. General Hawkins had already been placed on administrative leave pending the outcome of the investigation, and a temporary commander had been brought in to oversee base operations. Maria would need to testify before a formal hearing board, but she would receive full support from the chain of command. As Maria left the colonel's office, she felt a sense of vindication mixed with determination. She had stood up for herself and accidentally become a voice for many others who had suffered in silence. The path ahead would not be easy, but she was ready to see it through to the end. Word of the investigation spread quickly throughout the base, creating a buzz of excitement and anticipation. Many soldiers expressed relief that someone had finally stood up to General Hawkins, while others worried about the potential disruption to base operations. But everyone agreed that Maria had shown incredible courage in a situation where many others might have simply accepted the abuse. That evening, Maria received dozens of messages from soldiers across the base and even from other military installations. Many shared their own stories of harassment and discrimination, while others simply wanted to express their admiration for her bravery. She realized that her actions had sparked something much larger than she had ever intended, and she felt both honored and intimidated by the responsibility that now rested on her shoulders. 2 weeks after the incident, the formal hearing began in the base's main conference room. Maria had never seen so many high-ranking officers in one place, including generals from the Pentagon, who had flown in specifically for this case. The seriousness of their presence made it clear that this investigation had implications far beyond Fort Henderson. General Hawkins sat at the defendant's table with his military lawyer, looking older and more defeated than Maria had ever seen him. His usually perfect uniform seemed somehow diminished, and his confident demeanor had been replaced by a tense, defensive posture. Several times during the proceedings, Maria caught him glancing in her direction with a mixture of anger and something that might have been regret. The prosecution presented a devastating case against General Hawkins. Captain Walsh testified about what she had witnessed, presenting the security footage that clearly showed the assault. The video was played multiple times, and each viewing seemed to make the general's actions look worse. The audio captured not only the physical assault but also his degrading comments about women in the military. One by one, other victims came forward to testify about their own experiences with General Hawkins. Staff Sergeant Lisa Rodriguez spoke about being passed over for promotions despite exemplary performance reviews, always receiving feedback that suggested she wasn't tough enough for leadership roles. Corporal Amanda Foster described being subjected to inappropriate comments about her appearance and being assigned to menial tasks that had nothing to do with her specialized training. The most powerful testimony came from Lieutenant Sarah Kim, a military police officer who had been stationed at General Hawkins' previous base. She described a pattern of behavior that went back years, including incidents where he had physically intimidated female soldiers and created hostile work environments. Her testimony revealed that the problem was much larger and more systematic than anyone had initially realized. Maria's own testimony was the centerpiece of the prosecution's case. She spoke clearly and calmly about the events of that morning, describing not only the physical assault but also the emotional impact it had on her and her fellow soldiers. She explained how the incident had made her question whether she truly belonged in the military, despite her excellent performance record and deep love for her service. When asked why she had responded the way she did, Maria's answer resonated throughout the packed hearing room. She explained that she had learned from her training that the best way to handle intimidation was to respond professionally and to trust in the military justice system to protect soldiers who were doing their jobs correctly. Her faith in that system, she said, had ultimately been proven right. The defense attempted to portray General Hawkins as a demanding but fair leader who was simply trying to maintain high standards. His lawyer argued that his actions had been misinterpreted and that his long record of distinguished service should be taken into consideration. However, the mountain of evidence against him made these arguments seem weak and unconvincing. During cross-examination, the defense tried to suggest that Maria had been insubordinate and that her response to the general had been disrespectful. But Maria's calm professional demeanor during the questioning only reinforced the prosecution's portrayal of her as a model soldier who had been victimized by an officer who had abused his authority. The hearing also revealed disturbing details about how complaints against General Hawkins had been handled at previous assignments. Several witnesses testified about a culture of intimidation that discouraged reporting and retaliation against those who did speak up. It became clear that the military's systems for protecting soldiers from harassment had failed repeatedly over many years. Colonel Morrison testified about the changes that had already been implemented at Fort Henderson since the incident. New reporting procedures had been established, additional training programs were being developed, and a zero-tolerance policy for harassment had been clearly communicated to all personnel. She credited Maria's courage with creating the catalyst for these important reforms. As the hearing progressed, it became obvious to everyone present that General Hawkins's military career was over. The evidence against him was overwhelming, and the pattern of behavior that had been revealed made it impossible for the panel to view his actions as an isolated incident. The only question remaining was what specific charges he would face and what his punishment would be. The hearing concluded with closing arguments that painted two very different pictures of what had happened. The prosecution portrayed General Hawkins as a bully who had abused his power and violated the trust placed in him by the soldiers under his command. The defense made a final plea for leniency based on his years of service, but their arguments seemed hollow in the face of the evidence that had been presented. As the panel retired to deliberate, Maria felt a mixture of exhaustion and anticipation. The past 2 weeks had been emotionally draining, but she also felt proud of how she and the other witnesses had presented their cases. Whatever the outcome, she knew that they had told the truth and that their voices had finally been heard by people who had the power to make real changes. The panel deliberated for 3 hours before returning with their verdict. The hearing room was packed with soldiers from Fort Henderson and other bases, all waiting to hear the outcome of a case that had captured the attention of the entire military community. Maria sat in the front row, her hands clasped tightly in her lap as she prepared to hear the decision that would determine the course of her future and that of countless other soldiers. General Patricia Hayes, the senior officer on the panel, stood to deliver the verdict. Her voice was clear and authoritative as she announced that General Robert Hawkins had been found guilty on multiple charges, including assault, conduct unbecoming an officer, and violation of equal opportunity regulations. The room erupted in a mixture of gasps, quiet cheers, and relieved sighs as the weight of the decision settled over everyone present. The sentencing was equally significant. General Hawkins was stripped of his rank, dismissed from the military with forfeiture of all benefits, and ordered to serve 6 months in military prison. Additionally, he was required to pay restitution to his victims and was prohibited from ever holding a position of authority over military personnel again. The severity of the punishment sent a clear message that such behavior would not be tolerated at any level of the military hierarchy. Maria felt tears streaming down her face as she listened to the sentence being read. The validation of her experience and the experiences of so many others was overwhelming. She had risked everything by standing up to General Hawkins, and now she was witnessing the consequences of his actions being fully acknowledged by the military justice system. After the formal proceedings concluded, Maria was approached by Major General Susan Crawford, one of the highest-ranking female officers in the Army. She congratulated Maria on her courage and informed her that her case had already led to policy changes at installations across the country. New training programs were being implemented, reporting procedures were being strengthened, and a special task force had been created to review similar cases that might have been mishandled in the past. The impact of Maria's actions extended far beyond the courtroom. Within weeks of the verdict, dozens of soldiers from other bases came forward with their own stories of harassment and discrimination. Many cited Maria's case as inspiration for their decision to speak up, knowing that the military was finally taking these issues seriously and that victims would receive proper support and protection. Colonel Morrison announced that Fort Henderson would be implementing a comprehensive reform program that would serve as a model for other military installations. The program included regular climate surveys, enhanced reporting mechanisms, and mandatory training for all leadership personnel. Maria was asked to participate in the development of this program, sharing her insights and experiences to help create a safer environment for all soldiers. The media attention surrounding the case was intense, but generally positive. Maria found herself being interviewed by military publications and civilian news outlets, all wanting to hear about her experience and the changes it had prompted. While she was sometimes uncomfortable with the spotlight, she recognized the importance of using her platform to advocate for others who might be facing similar challenges. 3 months after the verdict, Maria received news that would change her life forever. She had been selected to attend officer candidate school, with the endorsement of senior leadership who recognized her potential as a future military leader. Additionally, she was being considered for a special assignment that would involve traveling to other bases to help implement the new harassment prevention programs that her case had inspired. The transformation at Fort Henderson was remarkable to witness. The atmosphere had changed dramatically since General Hawkins's departure, with soldiers reporting higher morale and increased confidence in the leadership structure. The new base commander, Colonel Michael Torres, had made it clear that all soldiers would be treated with respect and dignity, regardless of their gender, race, or background. Maria's promotion ceremony was attended by hundreds of soldiers and several high-ranking officers from the Pentagon. As she received her new sergeant stripes, she thought about how far she had come from that morning when General Hawkins had grabbed her hair. What had started as an act of humiliation had ultimately become a catalyst for positive change that would benefit countless soldiers for years to come. The ceremony concluded with Maria giving a speech about the importance of standing up for what is right, even when it seems impossible or dangerous. She emphasized that real strength comes not from intimidating others, but from protecting those who cannot protect themselves. Her words resonated deeply with the audience, many of whom had witnessed her journey from victim to advocate to leader. As Maria looked out at the sea of faces before her, she saw hope and determination reflected back at her. She knew that her fight was far from over, and that there would be many more challenges ahead. But she also knew that she had already proven that one person's courage could make a difference, and that gave her the strength to continue pushing for the changes that were still needed throughout the military. 6 months later, Sergeant Maria Santos found herself standing before a congressional committee in Washington, D.C. preparing to testify about military harassment and the need for systemic reform. The hearing room was filled with legislators, military officials, and advocates who had come to hear her story and learn about the changes that her case had prompted throughout the armed forces. The invitation to testify had come as a complete surprise to Maria. A group of senators had been conducting hearings on military culture and had specifically requested her presence after learning about her case and its aftermath. She felt nervous but honored to have the opportunity to speak directly to the lawmakers who had the power to create lasting change through legislation. As Maria took her seat at the witness table, she noticed several familiar faces in the audience. Captain Walsh had traveled from Fort Henderson to show her support, and Agent Chen was also present to provide additional testimony about his investigation. But most importantly, she saw other soldiers who had come forward with their own stories after her case, all of whom had become part of a growing movement for military reform. The committee chairman, Senator Robert Martinez, opened the hearing by acknowledging the courage it had taken for Maria and other soldiers to speak out about their experiences. He explained that the committee was considering several pieces of legislation that would strengthen protections for military personnel and create more effective mechanisms for addressing harassment and discrimination. Maria's testimony lasted for over an hour, as she detailed not only her own experience but also the broader cultural issues that had allowed General Hawkins' behavior to continue for so many years. She spoke about the fear that many soldiers felt about reporting misconduct, the retaliation that often followed complaints, and the need for independent oversight of military justice proceedings. One of the most powerful moments of her testimony came when she read from letters she had received from soldiers across the country. Many described similar experiences to her own, while others thanked her for giving them the courage to report their own cases of harassment. The human impact of these stories was evident on the faces of the committee members, several of whom asked follow-up questions about specific policy recommendations. During the question and answer session, Maria was asked about the changes she had seen at Fort Henderson since the investigation concluded. She described the dramatic improvement in morale and the increased confidence that soldiers now felt in their leadership. She also talked about the new training programs that had been implemented and how they were helping to create a more professional and respectful environment. The hearing also featured testimony from other military officials who had been working on reform initiatives inspired by Maria's case. Colonel Morrison spoke about the success of the programs at Fort Henderson and how they were being adapted for use at other installations. Major General Crawford provided data showing significant increases in harassment reporting and decreases in retaliation against those who came forward with complaints. Agent Chen presented findings from his expanded investigation, which had uncovered similar patterns of misconduct at multiple military installations. He explained how Maria's case had provided the breakthrough that investigators needed to build cases against other officers who had been abusing their authority. His testimony revealed that the problem was much more widespread than most people had realized, but also that meaningful progress was being made in addressing it. The committee members were particularly interested in Maria's recommendations for preventing future incidents. She emphasized the need for regular climate surveys, independent reporting mechanisms, and severe consequences for officers who violated their duty to protect their subordinates. She also advocated for better training for military leaders and clearer policies about what constituted appropriate behavior. During a break in the hearing, Maria was approached by several committee members who wanted to discuss her ideas in more detail. She found herself in impromptu policy discussions about everything, from military justice procedures to leadership development programs. The experience gave her a new appreciation for the complexity of creating systemic change, but also reinforced her belief that such change was both necessary and possible. The day concluded with closing statements from the committee members, many of whom praised Maria for her courage and professionalism. Several announced their intention to introduce legislation based on the testimony they had heard, while others committed to working with military leadership to implement administrative changes that could be made more quickly. As Maria left the Capitol building that evening, she reflected on how far she had traveled from that morning at Fort Henderson when General Hawkins had grabbed her hair. What had started as a moment of personal humiliation had evolved into a national conversation about military culture and the treatment of all soldiers. She felt proud of the role she had played in sparking that conversation, but also aware that there was still much work to be done. The media coverage of the hearing was extensive, with many news outlets focusing on Maria's compelling testimony and the broader implications of her story. Editorial writers praised her courage and called for swift action on military reform, while veterans organizations announced their support for the legislative changes that were being proposed based on her recommendations. That night, Maria received a phone call that would mark another turning point in her remarkable journey. She was being offered a position as a special advisor to the Pentagon's new Office of Military Culture and Climate, where she would help develop and implement reform initiatives across all branches of the military. It was an opportunity to continue the work she had started in a way that could affect positive change on an even larger scale. 2 years after the incident that changed her life, Lieutenant Maria Santos stood at the podium of the National Military Leadership Conference, addressing an audience of senior officers from all branches of the armed forces. Her uniform bore the insignia of her new rank and the ribbons representing her various commendations, including the Meritorious Service Medal she had received for her work in military reform. The transformation in Maria's life had been extraordinary, but perhaps more importantly, the changes she had helped bring about were now being felt throughout the entire military. The legislation inspired by her congressional testimony had been signed into law, creating new protections for service members and establishing independent oversight of harassment cases. Military installations across the country were implementing the training programs and policies that had first been tested at Fort Henderson. As Maria looked out at the hundreds of military leaders in the audience, she saw faces that reflected a new generation of officers who understood that true strength came from protecting and empowering their subordinates, rather than intimidating them. Many of these officers had themselves been influenced by the cultural changes that her case had helped to spark, and they were now carrying those values forward to their own commands. Her presentation that day focused on the measurable improvements that had been achieved in military culture over the past 2 years. Harassment reporting was up significantly, indicating that soldiers felt more confident about coming forward with complaints. More importantly, retaliation against those who reported incidents had decreased dramatically, suggesting that the new oversight mechanisms were working as intended. The data also showed improvements in retention rates, particularly among women and minority service members who had previously left the military at higher rates due to hostile work environments. Maria's story had become a symbol of hope for many soldiers who had been considering leaving the service, and her continued presence in uniform demonstrated that the military was serious about creating positive change. During the question and answer session, a young captain asked Maria what advice she would give to soldiers who were facing harassment, but were afraid to report it. Her response drew from her own experience, but also from the hundreds of cases she had worked on in her new role as a Pentagon advisor. Maria emphasized the importance of documenting incidents, seeking support from trusted colleagues, and remembering that speaking up was not just about protecting oneself, but also about protecting future soldiers who might face similar treatment. She also discussed the various reporting options that were now available, including anonymous hotlines and independent investigators who were trained specifically to handle these cases. The conference also featured testimonials from other soldiers whose lives had been changed by the reforms that Maria had helped to implement. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, who had testified at General Hawkins' hearing, spoke about her recent promotion to a leadership position and how the new training programs had prepared her to create a positive environment for her own troops. Captain Walsh, now a major, described how the legal reforms had made it easier for military lawyers to pursue harassment cases and ensure that victims received proper support throughout the process. She credited Maria's case with providing the precedent that had enabled dozens of other successful prosecutions of officers who had abused their authority. The most moving testimonial came from a young soldier named Private First Class Johnson, who had been stationed at a base where harassment had been a persistent problem. She described how learning about Maria's story had given her the courage to report her own experiences, and how the new support systems had helped her to continue her military career without fear of retaliation. As the conference concluded, Maria was approached by a group of junior officers who wanted to thank her personally for the changes she had helped to bring about. Many shared their own stories of how the improved climate in their units had allowed them to focus on their military duties rather than worrying about harassment or discrimination. The final event of the conference was a ceremony honoring several individuals who had made significant contributions to military reform. When Maria's name was called to receive the Distinguished Service Award, she was overwhelmed by the standing ovation that filled the auditorium. As she accepted the award, she thought about all the soldiers who had found their voices because she had found hers. In her acceptance speech, Maria reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. She spoke about the morning when General Hawkins had grabbed her hair and how her decision to respond with dignity rather than anger had set in motion changes that none of them could have imagined. She emphasized that her story was not just about one incident or one person, but about the power of institutions to change when individuals have the courage to demand better. Maria concluded her remarks by looking toward the future and the challenges that still remained. While significant progress had been made, she acknowledged that creating lasting cultural change was an ongoing process that would require continued vigilance and commitment from every member of the military community. She challenged the leaders in the audience to carry forward the work that had been started and to never become complacent about protecting the soldiers under their command. As Maria left the podium that day, she knew that her work was far from finished, but she also knew that the military she served was fundamentally different from the one she had joined years earlier, and that difference would benefit countless soldiers for generations to come. The young woman who had once stood at attention while a general grabbed her hair had become a leader whose courage had transformed an entire institution, proving that sometimes the most powerful response to injustice is simply refusing to accept it as normal.